Russia's announcement that it will deploy its tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus has left the United Nations Security Council seemingly divided. While the Western nations have expressed some serious concerns, Russia has said that there is absolutely no difference between what it plans to do and what NATO is already doing on European soil. Now, the United Nations Security Council met on Friday at the request of the United States and Albania, and the meeting was organized specifically to discuss the announcement made by the Russian President Vladimir Putin nearly about a week ago. The meeting also witnessed high drama as criticism by the West was refuted by Russia and its allies. Now, during the meeting, a top United Nations diplomat called for nuclear de-escalation, while the US representatives have called on Russia to drop its plans.
All states parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or the NPT, nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states alike, must strictly adhere to the commitments and obligations they have assumed under the treaty.
But President Putin is escalating Russia's dangerous and destabilizing behavior by now threatening to deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus. He has once again reminded the world of his disregard for international law, including the UN Charter. Russia's suggestion that this intended deployment is somehow justified because of the use of armor-piercing ammunition is ludicrous.
The harsh criticism, of course, came from the Ukrainian side as well. Ukraine's permanent representative to the United Nations has slammed Moscow over its decision. He said that the move was made as Russia is facing defeat, which is looking almost inevitable.
The nuclear blackmail is one of the tools that Russia has exploited since the very beginning of the invasion. In addition, the shelling and seizure of Ukrainian nuclear facilities that have also aggravated the nuclear threats at the global level. Today is the 401st day of the full-fledged war, and Russia demonstrates its failure to prevail on the battlefield. In a desperate attempt to avoid the unavoidable, its military defeat in Ukraine, Russia again resorts to waving its nuclear bludgeon.
But the ambassador from Russia has defended the plan, saying that it is in fact important to ensure safety of Russia and also its ally Belarus. Moscow maintains that there is no difference between what it intends to do in Belarus and NATO's deployment of American nuclear weapons in Europe.
Для обеспечения безопасности союзного государства России и Беларуси. Именно в этом направлении идут озвученные президентом меры, которые так напугали режим Зеленского и его западных спонсоров. Или вы всерьез рассчитывали на то, что мы не будем должным образом реагировать на ваши провокационные агрессивные действия?
Meanwhile, the Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has said that the country is ready to host even Russia's strategic nuclear weapons. During the meeting, Russia's another close ally, China, also interestingly raised concerns over the proliferation of nuclear weapons, but did not mention Russia by name.
主张最终全面禁止和彻底销毁核武器，呼吁废除核共享安排。 主张所有核武器国家都不应在境外部署核武器，并应撤出在境外部署的核武器。
Concurrently, Ukraine also hosted a meeting of foreign leaders. It was attended by leaders from Slovenia, Slovakia, Croatia and Moldova. During the meeting, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also commented on Russia's announcement. He claimed that this move signifies the meeting the Russian president has had with his Chinese counterpart.
Невдалу зустріч з Китаєм. Перше, що потрібно було показати якусь суб'єктність, яку Росія під керуванням президента Путіна повністю втратила. Друге, ще раз підкреслюю про те, що треба показувати якісь політичні кроки або перемоги.
Vladimir Putin, remember, had met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping just 2 weeks ago during his visit to Moscow, but China which is trying to portray itself as a bit of a peacemaker, has not been able to actually bring about any effect on the battlefield. Heavy sanctions from the West have not been able to deter Russia's offensive, and the war has sent headwinds across the world. And Ukraine's economy, as well as infrastructure, remain battered because of the conflict. The International Monetary Fund has now approved a 4-year loan program for its economy. Its amount is about $15.6 billion and is part of a global package of about $115 billion. And to give us more insights in terms of what this Russian threat of wanting to station nuclear weapons in its neighboring nation, of course, means, we're being joined by our guest Joachim Bitterlich, the former German ambassador to NATO and a former European diplomatic and security advisor to German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. Sir, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on WION. And let me in fact begin by asking you this. The Russians stating that they want to station their nuclear weapons in Belarus is of course a serious escalation which will have far-reaching consequences well beyond the Ukraine war. What is your assessment on why Russia intends to now station its nuclear weapons in Belarus?
In my eyes, this is a new attempt of intimidation of Ukraine and of the nations supporting the Ukraine in this invasion against the Russians. And intimidation because there's only one nation introducing the threat of the use, the potential use of nuclear weapons is Russia, no one else. No one from the Western side has ever been, let's say, threatening Russia or threatening the Russian sovereignty in this war. And therefore, it's a new attempt of intimidation. And it seems to me that Russia is under real military and political pressure in the conflict in Ukraine. And what's even to some extent silly is the trying to put an analogy towards the NATO deployment of nuclear weapons.
You know, that was my obvious next question to you, because the Russians are comparing their stationing of nuclear weapons in Belarus as no different from the American deployment of, nuclear weapons in 5 different European bases. So they're asking this question: if Americans can in fact deploy their nuclear weapons in their in the territory of their allies in Europe, then why should Russia not do so by deploying its nuclear weapons on the soil of one of its allies?
But it's a comparison between, let's say, pears and other fruits. It's not comparable because NATO has been deploying these nuclear weapons, let's say, years ago, decades ago. It's in existence for years, and these are not tactical nuclear weapons. These are strategical nuclear weapons that have been, let's say, part of the nuclear scene between the West and the East for the last, let's say, 30 years. For example, I've been a young officer 50 years ago in the German army. We had deployed Pershing missiles. And the nuclear warhead was an American one, but it was not at all a tactical nuclear weapon. What the Russians do now is to deploy tactical nuclear weapons, short-range nuclear weapons to apply in the battlefield, not in the classical nuclear way. Right. This is, for me, a new step of a nuclear threat on the Russian side in order to intimidate or to case the Ukrainians.
All right, very interestingly put. But the Russians, my final question to you, sir, is this. The Russians have, of course, turned around and said the only reason why the Americans maintain their nuclear weapons on European soil is, in fact, to create some kind of a deterrence against Russia. And Russia has also gone on to state that the reason why there is this conflict, there is this war in Ukraine in the first place, is because the NATO military alliance, which has been hostile to the Russian interests, has been expanding its frontiers closer and closer to the Russian borders, even though in the 90s, after the USSR fragmented, the NATO military alliance in the Western nations had said that they would not move an inch eastwards. And therefore, the Russians say that this is a clear betrayal and NATO's intentions are clearly suspect.
But please, there has never been such a promise in the early 90s. In the early 90s, the question has been Germany. What to do with Eastern Germany, where there had been until 1990, 94, at the end, more than 400,000 Russian soldiers, including, as we suppose, nuclear weapons. And the retreat of the Russians was, let's say, the deal of a German reunification. And at that very period, we did not discuss at all about NATO expansion. NATO expansion became later because these countries who were former, let's say, under the Soviet umbrella, from the Warsaw Pact, were looking for being protected against the Russians. Against this, the Russians clearly, let's say, trying to expand. And NATO, the Americans, as the Europeans promised then, these states, Poland, the Baltics, and others, to protect them via an accession to NATO. But there has been no deployment of nuclear weapons in these countries, not at any moment.
All right, very interesting there. I do not think the Russians would agree.
Expansion.
All right. No, I think you've made your point. Absolutely, indeed, sir. But we are completely out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Joachim Bitterlich, for joining us and getting us all those insights. I'm not sure to what extent the Russians would, of course, agree or concur with you on these issues, but these are very thorny and prickly issues for which there is no immediate answer. But thank you very much indeed for joining us and giving us your perspective on what is happening in this conflict.
As always, a pleasure.
Thank you very much. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.